Let me introduce myself first. My name is Leonid Seleznev. I'm professor of the St. Petersburg State University in Russia, and I'm serving at the university since 1963, for quite a long time. I was born in Leningrad, in the USSR at the time, the Soviet Union, and I was born on the one day in December 1931. So now I am 81 years old, and I lived the majority of my years in Leningrad, with some exceptions, and I'm going to mention that during my introduction. Before the war, the Second World War, I joined a school, an ordinary school, but with one exception. It was an English-speaking school in Leningrad, while in the majority of the schools at that time, German was taught as the principal language, because we had before the war rather extended economic relations with Germany. It was a tradition for Russia, by the way, to rely upon Germans' experience and knowledge and their skills in arranging everything in life. This is not a feature of the Russian people, I should say, to be better organized. But somehow, well, I spent 2 years in school before the war started, and it was the Second World War that started in 1939, and France was already occupied, as some other European states such as Holland, Belgium, and maybe even more, when Hitler, after failure in his attempts to conquer Great Britain, decided to move his forces to the east against Russia, against the Soviet Union, and the war started on the 22nd of June 1941. I mean the war involving the Soviet Union, and Germany attacked the Soviet Union without declaring any war, and all of a sudden, it was on Sunday day, and I remember it well, but nevertheless, the German forces, mainly, they have a predominance in tank forces and in aviation in comparison with the Soviet army. And so they moved very quickly because the Soviet Union failed to prepare itself against the war from the German side. It was not expected at that time. They moved in 3 main directions. I mean, the German forces, and one of the main strike was aimed at captured Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. The northern wing went to capture Leningrad, and the southern wing went to capture Stalingrad. You see, this was the Barbarossa plan that was invented by Hitler and his surroundings. And on the way to Leningrad, the northern group of German forces encountered fierce resistance maybe 100 miles away from the city, where the so-called Luga defensive line was erected, and the German forces, for the first time in the Second World War, were stopped for a month and a half. And you see that it was of great importance to get the city better prepared for defense. This period of time was used intensively to erect defensive lines, and a part of that to get better prepared the city for defense. And when the Germans in the second half of August 1941 broke through the defensive lines, and they came close to the city, to the vicinity of the city, and they enclosed it, and Leningrad was cut off the rest of the country. The Germans, they used their predominance in tank force and in aviation to attack the city, but nevertheless they were stopped. But then decided to starve the city population without more attacks against it, because they suffered very heavy losses during the attacks. So the city was enclosed by the blockade, and the Siege of Leningrad started exactly on the 8th of September 1941, and it lasted for almost 900 days. You see, the population that was left in the city counted for 2.5 million of population, and approximately 1 million was evacuated before the Germans came close to the city. So the Siege of Leningrad started on the day that I mentioned, and the day is precisely defined because the Germans, they enclosed the city and cut it off the rest of the country. And the main problem, as I can tell was the supplies of the city, how they could be supplied, the population. They started to starve, and hunger was the main enemy at the time. I remember it well because I was already 10 years old, and when the Siege of Leningrad started, almost 10 years old, and I have a vivid memory how well we survived, not all of us, but half of the population died of starvation. Only 5% were killed by bombs and shells from the German side. And I remember well that it was a very severe winter, and all the city was covered by snow, heavy snowfalls, and there was no electricity supplies, no water supplies, no canalization. You can hardly imagine even how a huge metropolitan city could live under such circumstances, but people started to die of hunger, maybe. But nevertheless, you see, it was why? Well, Russians suffered greatly during the Second World War, and in many places people starved to death. But it was a unique occasion that happened in Leningrad, because the population not only starved and died in mass, but they also fought against the Germans. You see, the whole of industry worked, and the starving people went to their factories and industrial enterprises to produce armaments and ammunition. And you see, the figures here are very striking, by the way. I can mention to you what was produced during the Siege of Leningrad. This starving population that couldn't be forced to go to work, but they worked because of their high spirits, by the way, and common support. The production of arms and ammunition during the siege, tanks, over 2,000, airplanes, over 1,500, artillery guns, 4,500, mortars, 12,000, automatic rifles, over 200,000, machine guns, over 12,000, artillery and mortar shells, over 7.5 million of units, you see, of pieces of artillery and mortar shells. Then warships, cargo and auxiliary ships, because Leningrad was the major port of the Soviet Union. Over 1,250 of them, of the ships, repaired or built within the city. You see, and that's why the city practically produced more armaments and ammunition that was needed for defense of the city. And when there were supplies coming, foodstuffs, by air, you see, the planes took back armaments and ammunition from the besieged city to help Moscow in their defenses and other fronts of the Great Patriotic War, as the Second World War was called in my country. So half of the population died of starvation, and but half left alive. And in January, on 27th of January 1944, the armed forces liberated the city, and the siege of Leningrad ended. So that's why we know precisely the dates and how everything went on at that time. So this was the first case in history of wars when a big city besieged from all sides by enemies withstand and freed itself. Only one experience. My uncle and I went to the foodstuff shop to receive foodstuffs or the coupons, and there was a big park near the house we lived in, and when we went across the park, we saw half a body lying there in the park. It was cut, you see, on the waistline, and the legs were not present at all. You see, there was half a corpse, and well, we understand that a man or a woman, I don't know, that person died, maybe it fell, and someone cut the legs and buttocks so to eat it. It was the case of cannibalism that you mentioned in the question. It was not a widespread phenomena. Well, we knew at the time that some people went mad out of hunger. See, because dystrophia, this is the name of the illness that the majority of population, all the population suffered during the Siege of Leningrad. It affects brain as well. You see, brain produces signals that you should eat and eat and eat, and it is intolerable. For instance, well, this is my impression as well, that when you wake up amid night, you see, and you suffer hunger, you can't sleep any longer. You see, and sleepless nights and sleepless days affect brain as well. And so I can assure you that nobody, the singles who went mad about, well, as a result of starvation, they didn't survive. Not a single person. They died because they went mad and they couldn't survive under these harsh circumstances that I mentioned to you. Where we took drinking water, for instance, we were happy that the Neva is a huge current connecting the Ladoga Lake, the biggest in Europe, and the Finnish Gulf, you see. So we, my elder brother and I, with the sleigh, we went every day to the Neva River to have 2 casks of water, bringing back it to whom it was suffice to feed the family that consisted of our mother and 2 kids, 2 boys. So then we warmed ourselves by, at the time, we were fortunate again that there was, in majority of the houses of the city, there were no central heating system, and we have stoves, and we have firewoods, you see, and everything should be done by hand. And so we were busy supporting our lives, but hunger was, starvation was the main cause of our concern, even for those who survived. See, Stalin's popularity was widespread, but I should say more that it is not included in the question. I think the arrangements that led to the dominance of the Communist Party was of great importance. The Communist Party appeared to be, during the wartime, the best of kind of organization that penetrated all spheres of life of the whole of population. And I remember when, during the first months of the siege, when the bombing started, usually it was announced by radio, and the radio was switched in always in every home. There was no TV at the time, but radio was sufficient, and there were alarms, you see, sent throughout the city, and we should go down to the shelter that was in the basement of every house. So when the population, still alive at that time, during the first months of the siege, when we didn't suffer from hunger yet. You see that there were political informations led by the Communist Party members. They went to the population, they explained the situation within the city and what was the ratio going to be introduced, ration coupons to feed the country, how the population withstand the bombing raids by the German aviation, how we should hide ourselves from the shells, because the artillery bombardment became more and more important, and we were told the numbers of German planes bombers shot down by our interceptor fighters. Then it was kept secret, was not told, but the rumors were at that time, and it was not denied by this party agitators that see that when Leningrad had a great scientific potential, and the first radars were invented in Leningrad, and they were produced in Leningrad. And the Germans didn't know about any radars at all. But the radar stations were installed in all directions of the German approach. And the German aviation groups, large ones, you see that up to 100 and 200 pieces of bombers coming in the direction of the city, they were detected 200 kilometers away. That means well, about 130 miles. And with the speed at that time of the bombers, you see, they were always intercepted by our fighter planes on the vicinity of the approach, you see, on the vicinity of the city, and many of them were shot down, and so it was aimless to bomb the city, and because of this heavy losses, they resorted to artillery bomb shelling. And practically towards the end of 1941, bombing was ceased by the Germans because of the losses that I mentioned. Then a small effect of the bombing raids. But when you remember, I mentioned how many millions of artillery shells and mortar shells were produced, but there was enough metal in the city, produced in the city, but there was lack of powder. But one of the professors of the Forestry Academy invented from forest, you see, from the woods, the new powder. So even during these harsh times, you see, scientific workers, they did their job, their contribution, and it was an enormous one. And at the university I belong to now, mathematicians made special calculations how to precisely direct the artillery fire. And so they produced schemes that were distributed to all artillery units. So our artillerymen can operate by these schemes to make the sharing of German positions more accurate, more precise, and more devastated for them. So I tell you all these facts because you can understand that, well, there is a widespread knowledge in history books that the population starved to death and half of the population died, but all alive were fighting and were making their contribution to the common war effort, and not only of the Soviet Union, but of all allied nations, Great Britain included. So this is one of my explanations of what was the popularity of the Communist Party and of Stalin. It was, you see, and at the same time, the population defended itself. You see, under the influence and command of the local party of Leningrad. You see, and maybe Stalin felt a bit envy about that, because he was not personally involved in the defense of Leningrad. And well, there was some then complications connected with that fact. See, I'm quite sure the Soviet army couldn't take over the war and to win the war without Stalin's guidance. He was the commander-in-chief. And by memories of the best marshals of the war, the Soviet marshals, such as Zhukov, you might remember his name. He was one of the most brilliant marshals in command of the Soviet army. And he, by the way, Zhukov signed the act of capitulation that we are going to mark tomorrow, the anniversary of which. And in his memoirs, he wrote how well Stalin conducted the war and was in command. He was a genius, as Mr. Churchill called him. When Stalin died in 1953, Sir Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he went immediately to the House of Commons and he made a speech that ran such. I remember well the first words and the last portion of his speech. The genius of Stalin died. This was the beginning of his speech. And the last part of his speech was that Stalin took over Russia from Lenin with a plug, and he left to his successors Russia with the atomic bomb. And you might know that Churchill hated communism, hated Stalin, until the Soviet Union was involved in a war with Germany. And then Churchill, as a very wise statesman, understood that with the help of the Soviet Union, Britain can win during the war. And this is the fact. And there's some criticism. Sometimes it is foolish criticism nowadays by the Russian historians. For instance, they say that Stalin disregarded the Siege of Leningrad and the population of Leningrad, while the planes were sent to Leningrad with foodstuffs. They carried back arms and ammunition, but not the starving population, at least women and children, you see. But they disregard the fact that if I were Stalin, the commander-in-chief at that time, when the Germans came closer to Moscow, and Moscow was practically defenseless at that time. And in case I were commander-in-chief of the Soviet army, I would make all possible within the means available to defend Moscow. It was the heart of the Soviet Union. And then you see that if Germans succeeded in capturing Moscow, then they moved their forces to capture Leningrad as well. They enforce the group of armies of the North group of armies, and it was of no use, you see. And then the population that was left in Leningrad was needed for Stalin as commander-in-chief, because they produced military equipment and they kept 500,000 of German forces around the city, because they couldn't move away. Otherwise they could be used on other fronts and in the Battle of Moscow as well. So I don't think, and I can't share the views that are widespread nowadays, that Stalin was wrong and the Soviet population won the war without Stalin. It is not, it is contrary to historic evidence and historic truth. To no extent. Although we were as communists at the time, we were and we cherished Stalin's name, we were very disappointed with the revelations made by Khrushchev. By the way, it undermined the communist movement in different countries of the world, but not in the Soviet Union at that time. And by the way, Khrushchev himself was part of the Stalin's rule, of the Stalin's clique that was in power in the Soviet Union at the time. See that I was very fortunate to be in Delhi as part of the Soviet embassy when our relations went through the best of that could be achieved at the time. And you see that we supported strongly and materially Nehru's efforts in industrialization of India, of New India, after colonial, hundreds of years of colonial rule. And the Soviet Union took an obligation to build huge industrial enterprises in India. And you see the first industrial plant, it is metallurgical metallurgical works at Bhilai was built when I was in Delhi. And we started to build several other huge enterprises unknown to the colonial India. And a part of that, with our active participation, I mean the staff of the embassy, military and technical cooperation between the Soviet Union and India started at that time, and we supplied the Indian army with weaponry, ammunition, especially by fighter planes and bombers as well, and started the production of military equipment in India. By the way, even now, you should know that the Indian army is armed predominantly with Soviet-made weaponry. And there were 3 wars between India and Pakistan, irrespective of our position. You see, there were religious controversies after division of colonial India in 2 parts, the Muslim part of Pakistan and India as the Hindus, the predominantly Hindus population. And they fought against each other 3 times, and every time India had an upper hand as a result of these conflicts. So I think that my participation in the work of the embassy was not in vain. At that time, we reached the first place in Indian trade. It was 22.5% of all India trade. We even surpassed Great Britain and the United States of America at that time. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, things changed greatly. You see, the majority of teachers, professors at the university were Communist Party members. So we laid restrictions on our own. See, we were not directly restricted, and never were, but we understood our position properly. It was a self-restriction. And this differs from the understanding from outside. I don't hide the fact that I was a member of the Communist Party as well, but I joined the party because after, as postgraduate student, I was offered diplomatic job. It was attractive. You should share my feelings at that time, but I was told that I should join the Communist Party to serve as a diplomat. So I joined the party when I was 29 years old already. So not very early, not moved by a career, by intentions. But I considered this quite normal at that time. And so I didn't reside from the Communist Party. I ceased to be a member of the Communist Party when Yeltsin prohibited the Communist Party. It was one of his first moves. In my sense, he was a traitor. He was one of the leaders of the Communist Party, as you know, an alternative member of the Politburo. And he acted against the party that grew him up as a political figure. No, it was the continuation of the previous years, but without any punishments on the part, and there were no terror any longer after Khrushchev came into power, after Stalin's death. And though communists are blamed for the fact that many people were assassinated in concentration camps and simply prosecuted, it was not true after Stalin's death. And Brezhnev's period, called a stagnation, was maybe the one period when country prospered most. And this was the fact. The living standards went up, at that time, and we were not so engaged in our memories of war. Society. It changed it greatly because there was a need for such perestroika and glasnost, openness, or this is transparency called, on the part of the leaders of the Communist Party and of the Soviet government. I think that the society changed after Gorbachev came into power, and he played a positive role in this respect. At the same time, he was not sophisticated enough and not shrewd enough as a statesman, because he led the Soviet Union to crash. He was naive in some respects. For instance, he trusted the word of the leaders of the Western countries. They said, please withdraw your forces from Germany, and we shall never, we promise you, we shall never make Germany part of the NATO. And as soon as Gorbachev withdrew the Soviet army from Germany, eastern part of Germany, you see, immediately Germany was included into the NATO. And the NATO moved to the borders of Russia. And you see that the efforts that was made during the Second World War under Stalin's leadership were fertile, and they ended simply. You see that no more defenses could withstand the fact that the NATO is now bordering Russia. I think that the methods that proved to be correct during the years of industrialization and during the war efforts, during the World War II, see, they ceased to work further on. They should be changed. And Gorbachev tried it, but not with the best means available at that time. And you see that what was maybe the achievement of the Soviet Union and of the Communist Party in the previous years, towards the end of the 20th century, they ceased to work properly. And it was necessary to introduce more changes. You see that our society became more ripe, more sophisticated again, and more educated, that I should stress especially. And you see, the educated people differed greatly from that was inherited during and after the October Revolution of 1917. And the population should be educated population, enlightened population should be treated in a different way than simply to command, as it happened in the previous years. You see, more voice should be given to the civil society, and it was not done in due time. And the elderly leadership, the elderly to the extent that even we calculated to celebrate 1000th anniversary of members of the Politburo, the ruling circle, you see, that ruled the country and the Communist Party. But we were very disappointed when Suslov, the eldest member of the Politburo, died, because we should wait several years to celebrate this 1,000 years of the Politburo members taken together, but all of them were over 80 years old, you see. And by the way, learning from the experience of the Soviet Union, the Chinese communist leadership now introduced a rule that is observed strictly, that members of the Politburo, the leaders of the party, of the Communist Party of China, should serve not until they reach the age of 60 years, see, and they should change the membership of the Politburo every 10 years for this purpose. And now newcomers to the Politburo after 10 years of service on the highest party posts, positions, they are now 60 years old, all of them. And the new leaders are 60, not more. And I think this was the Chinese, how they used the experience of the Soviet Union, and when they do not want to repeat the dissolution of the Soviet Union for China. Under the circumstances that existed at the time, it was. See, it changed greatly because the market economy was introduced by Yeltsin and his supporters. Gaidar was prime minister, the first prime minister under Yeltsin, and he was a liberal economist from Chicago School of Economics. And his, teachers, real teachers, were Friedman and Hayek, those who opposed Keynesian teaching of interference of the state in economic development, and they were adherents of the free economy with free market economy. So the free market economy went to the situation when Stalin is again in great esteem among the majority of population. And why so? Because now the Russian population is split into two different groups. See, a handful of very rich men that enrich yourself, taken over the state property, in their private property, free. This was the idea of Gaidar, and when Gaidar was asked, what is the main purpose of your policy, economic policy, he said, to create a new class of businessmen. He didn't even mention population as such, the working, the toiling people. And they created these oligarchs. Say that the Forbes magazine publishes every year the list of oligarchs and their multi-billionaires among them, and among the first 100, maybe a dozen of Russians. And they present the kind of capitalism, of market economy, that runs contrary to the wishes and position of the majority of population. And you see that if it is considered normal in Western countries, when the split among maybe the richest ones and the rest of the population is 1-6 in favor of the rich people. In Russia, it is now dozens of times of difference, you see, and while the majority of population didn't gain much from the market economy. Some people enriched themselves, and we see that it is a split society now, when the middle class, that is always in all advanced societies the core of the civil society, and the middle class ranges well, in share of the population, of total population, is about 70% in Western countries. In Russia it is only about 20%, far less than in Western advanced countries, and then the majority of this middle class are bureaucracy. And because you see that even, well, I can tell you frankly, for instance, the professor of the university received a salary between 20 and 30,000 of rubles. Rubles was devalued during these reforms, economic reforms under Yeltsin, while the members of the government, the bureaucracy, they receive at least 10 times higher salaries. And you said that, well, I remember just the words of great Abraham Lincoln, who said, it's a neglected population when his servants live much better than the population itself. You see, he is a rather shrewd politician, but not a statesman. And he follows the line, the policy adopted by Yeltsin, his predecessor, who appointed Putin, by the way. And you see that it's unprecedented, but the first decree by the new president, Putin, when he came into office, when Yeltsin handed him over, was decree on the position of the first president of Russia. That means Yeltsin. And you see that the whole family of the first president should be exempted from criminal prosecution. This is funny because you see, and I see your smiles, because you see, that means that Putin acknowledged that there were criminal activities on parts of the first family when Yeltsin was president of Russia.